but that patrol fought no major engagements. Garnett was camped 15 miles from the fort on his way home from that patrol when a messenger reached him with the news that his wife and son had both died of bilious fever or typhoid. Their lead-lined coffins were sent east. Garnett got permission for leave to bury his family, and about 3 years later, during the Civil War, Garnett, then a brigadier general with the Confederacy, was the first officer of general's rank to die in the Civil War. He died on July 13th, 1861 at Carrick's Ford, Virginia. Garnett was 41 years old. And oddly enough, the commander of the Union troops at Carrick's Ford was General George B. McClellan. And a Robert H. Milroy, Indiana volunteers who saw Garnett fall, became Yakima Indian agent in the early 1880s and occupied Garnett's old quarters at Fort Simcoe. In May of 1859, after 3 years as a military fort, Fort Simcoe was evacuated. The troops were moved north to Fort Colville, Washington, and the Indian Service took over the fort. The Reverend James Harvey Wilbur, a 6'4", 300-pound Methodist minister, founded the agency school at Fort Simcoe in 1861. The Indians called him Father Wilbur. After 2 Indian agents were dismissed for graft, Father Wilbur was appointed Indian agent on the Yakima Reservation by President Abraham Lincoln in 1864. Father Wilbur was the Yakima Indian agent in the 1860s and 1870s. According to Father Wilbur, the Bible and the plow are more helpful in securing peace between the Indians and the whites than 1,000 soldiers and their glistening sabers and their prancing steeds. John Mattoon, an early Yakima Valley settler, said that Father Wilbur had a commanding voice and was seldom disobeyed by anyone. He was quick to think and act, slow to anger, but resolute when aroused. Wilbur himself once said, "When I find dogs biting people, I don't just say, 'Dogs don't bite,' I do something about it." Father Wilbur would not tolerate alcohol on the reservation. When a French Canadian living near Parker, Washington was selling alcohol to the Indians, Father Wilbur, 5 mounted Indian police, and 3 settlers raided his cabin. They found a 10-gallon keg buried in a hog pen. That French Canadian was placed in the agency jail until he apparently got religion and was released. On another occasion, a young German living on Sadis Creek, about 12 miles from the fort, was selling whiskey to the Indians. Father Wilbur, riding his mule Calico, visited the young German. Wilbur ignored the man's double-barrel shotgun and knife, tied the man up, locked him in the fort's jail for 3 days, and then gave him a saddle and $20. That young German settled near Spokane and was a good citizen after that. In late September of 1866, Father Wilbur buried his good friend Nathan Olney at the fort. Olney was a former Indian subagent for Oregon and had been sheriff of Wasco County, Oregon. He died when a fall from a horse drove an Indian arrowhead from an earlier battle with Indians into his brain. Olney's wife Annette, about 40 people on horseback, and the 5 Olney children, 4 boys and a girl, brought Nathan's body on a travoy pulled by a horse to Fort Simcoe for burial. In the summer of 1877, there was a big gathering of Indians near Wenatchee on the banks of the Columbia River. It was considered to be the camp of Chief Moses. On July 8, 1877, Chief Moses went to meet with General Howard at the Fort Simcoe Indian Agency. The government's position was that Chief Moses and his people, the Middle People, were to go to the Yakima Reservation to live permanently. Moses told them in part, "My Indians are scattered over a large country. I cannot say what they will do. I am ready to go on any reservation except this at Fort Simcoe. Several tribes of the Indians above the Spokane River have invited me to become their chief, and if they shall have a reservation, I would like to go with them." Moses made his mark on a formal paper agreeing to a council with General Howard in 25 days where Howard would consider the reservation request. A meeting took place on August 16th, 1877, near Spokane Falls, but General Frank Wheaton was there instead of General Howard. Chief Moses wasn't there either. The message sent by way of Colonel Watkins was mishandled, and Moses may not have received it. General Howard at that time was busy with the Paiute and Bannock War in Oregon and Idaho. On the afternoon of July 9th, 1878, Lorenzo and Blanche Perkins were killed by 8 or so Indians about 60 miles east of Fort Simcoe. He was a 35-year-old cattleman. She was from Yakima City. They had been married a year earlier. There's a photograph of Blanche Perkins in a display at the Yakima Museum, as well as Fort Simcoe artifacts, including a Fort Simcoe Army logbook. In a book written by General Howard, he says that near the close of the Paiute and Bannock War, a few renegade Indians engaged in that war succeeded in crossing the Columbia from south to north and murdered a white family by the name of Perkins. The murderers then pushed on and encamped near Moses, doubtless hoping to incite him to rebellion. The renegade murderers failed in this, but continued to skulk around somewhere in the Big Bend of the Columbia. General Howard eventually met with Chief Moses and had a council of 2 days' duration. In his book, Howard says that through Moses, they made a formal request that the Big Bend of the Columbia should be set apart as their home and that they might have some territory on the other side of the river. I made a note of their request and promised to forward it to the President and to convey to them his reply. This was the President's answer through his secretary. Agent Wilbur believes that he can bring Moses and his people without trouble on the Yakima Reservation. Let this be done if possible. Second, should Agent Wilbur fail in this, then the Indians' request will be granted. In early December of 1878, there was a meeting in Yakima City. Chief Moses attended that meeting, and he agreed to help the people of Yakima and the Indian people at the Fort Simcoe Indian Agency in sending out an expedition to capture the Perkins murderers. Moses agreed to furnish 10 men. Yakima City got up a force of 50 men led by Bill Splawn. On the 20th of December 1878, Chief Moses and 9 of his men were disarmed, put in irons, and taken to Yakima City, where they were put in jail. The Splawn expedition apparently thought that Moses was in league with the Perkins murderers. Father Wilbur went to Yakima City a week later, got Moses out of jail, and took him to the jail at Fort Simcoe. Moses was released about 3 months later when the Department of Indian Affairs invited him to Washington, D.C. The Moses Agreement for the Spokane Reservation was authorized by Presidential Executive Order on April 19, 1879. Chief Moses shook hands with President Rutherford B. Hayes in the White House Library and said, "This will make me a bigger Indian than ever." In January of 1879, a group of 543 Paiute and Bannock Indians were under guard at Fort Harney, Oregon, about 16 miles from Burns, Oregon. Princess Sarah Winnemucca and her mother were among them. They were ordered to go 350 miles north to Fort Simcoe as punishment for supposed sympathy with the Bannock uprising in Oregon and Idaho. There were 50 wagons and 543 people. It was midwinter. A snowstorm struck the first day. Sarah's mother, the widow of Chief Winnemucca, died the second day. One child was stillborn. One child was born and died after 3 days. 3 children died of exposure. Sarah survived and later set up a Paiute school. Father Wilbur didn't know that these people were on their way to Fort Simcoe until they actually arrived. Fort Simcoe continued to be the Yakima Indian Agency until about 1921, when it was abandoned and the Indian Agency was moved to Toppenish. There's an interpretive center at Fort Simcoe, and if you go out to the fort, be sure to visit it. Inside you'll find an authentic mat lodge, the old school bell, an old drawing of the fort, a map of the military operations, and a whole series of display cases that tell about Indian basketry, tools and weapons, foods, the construction of the fort, personalities associated with the fort, life at the fort, the military campaigns, the Indian agency period of the fort, agency construction, and especially the restoration of the fort. My favorite story about Fort Simcoe is the story about how it came to be restored. The people responsible for that are the members of the Mool Mool Society. I had a chance to visit with George Martin the other day. He's an attorney in Yakima, and he's been the secretary of the Mool Mool Society since it was formed in the early 1950s. But here, I'll let George tell that part of the story.
It all started because of the fact that I was interested in the history of the Yakima Valley. It actually started because as a kid, I was a stamp collector and still am over the years. And as a stamp collector, I became interested in the postal history of the Yakima Valley, the history of our post offices, which are a very fascinating tale how the early post offices started. And Fort Simcoe was one of the very first early day post offices of the Yakima Valley. And I went to Fort Simcoe at one time to see what I could discover in the nature of postal history. At that time, Fort Simcoe had been abandoned. The doors were open, cattle, various animals, most everything made their way through the buildings, and the various papers and documents of Fort Simcoe in the early days had never been removed, but they were just scattered everywhere through the floors of the buildings, and a lot of them have been damaged and destroyed by cattle and rats and other animal life had destroyed the equipment. But I was in the search of postal history material, and then seeing how bad the fort was at that time, it just was against my nature that this should be not something shouldn't be done to preserve it. So that led to the fact that I became actually very much interested in the history of Fort Simcoe by itself because of the amount of Yakima Valley history that was centered on the fort. You see, there wasn't any town at all in Yakima Valley. There wasn't a town in existence prior to 1870. And yet Fort Simcoe was built in 1856. And at that time, there was traders out by Fort Simcoe, and actually there was one trader right on the grounds, and it was almost a town. Well, Fort Simcoe is really a very interesting spot in the history of the Yakima Valley. Started out, of course, as a military fort, served as military fort for 3 years. Then the military pulled out, and it became the Yakima Indian Agency at that time, and also became a school. They had 2 schools there, one for girls and one for Indian boys. In 1921, or approximately, the fort ceased to be an agency. It was moved to Toppenish. And at that time, the fort itself it was abandoned. Nothing was done with it. Cattle, snakes, animals, everything just overrun the fort. And then during the Depression years, the Civilian Conservation Corps was established, and they had a unit of the CCC out near Fort Simcoe, and they went in and did some cleanup, started to try to do something about bringing the fort into some sort of condition. And then that was pulled out, and everything they had done went by the board again, and things were getting very bad. After World War II came along, it seemed like that the fort had no chance of being saved at all, but some of us wanted to save the fort if at all possible, and two of us especially. One was H. Dean Guy, who was an editorial writer for the Yakima papers and also quite a historian, and myself started to discuss what we could do with Fort Simcoe, if anything. We did some preliminary investigation as to what legally might be required, and we conceived the idea that it might be nice to have Fort Simcoe made into a national monument. At that time, first thing we had to do was to get the Indians themselves to be cooperative and helpful. And so we approached the tribal council of the Yakima Indians and told them what we had in mind to try to make that into a park and restore Fort Simcoe. They were somewhat interested. It was a long, drawn-out process because Dean Guy and myself had attended the tribal council meetings about every couple of weeks for several months before we could finally get a vote to be taken to allow the restoration of Fort Simcoe. Then we contacted the National Park Service, and the National Park Service sent a team into Yakima Valley and looked over the fort at Simcoe, and they decided that at that time they didn't think it was a type of a fort that they wanted at that time to make into a national monument, and they did agree to cooperate with us and suggested that we approach the state of Washington, the State Parks and Recreation Commission, to see if they wouldn't be interested in making a state park out of it. We did approach the state park people, and they came over and looked at it, and they were quite interested and decided that if we could do the preliminary work, why they would see what could be done. A fellow named Albert Culverwell was one of the people that they sent over, and he was very much interested in it. Well, getting along a little bit further, we found that before we could do much of anything in regard to the fort itself, that it was necessary that we go to Congress of the United States and get an act passed that would allow the fort to be made into a park and allow the state of Washington to obtain a long-term lease that would allow them to operate the park. Dean and I presented this matter to the congressional people, and it was about this time that we organized the Fort Simcoe Mool Mool Restoration Society, because we figured we had to have more help and more clout. And anyway, Congress did pass the act, the Enabling Act, and the Fort Simcoe Mool Mool Restoration Society was organized, and we found that it became very exciting to the people of the Yakima Valley, especially people that had something to do with the fort. We found we had considerable response and membership. At one time, our membership was up around 200 people. Oscar Scheller of Sunnyside agreed to serve as a chairman or president of the society, and I served as the secretary. And we proceeded to followed through, and after the act was passed by Congress and we presented the matter further to the State Parks and Recreation Commission, they agreed to take it over as a state park. Restoration required that we do a lot of work on the officers' quarters there, and which were really in bad repair, but on the other hand, it's rather remarkable how much remained in there, and most of the original windows were still there, fortunately, and things of that kind. And so, by means of our society, of getting information and means of the state Parks Department, they came over, and between the two of us working together, restoration got underway. We had to find people who could do some of these things and do the adzing the planks for the old, same as they were in the original structures, and even had to locate the whole-time tools that we could use. And the parade grounds was quite a restored. Of course, at that time they were all dirt, and now they're grass for people, but there was really otherwise they're just about the same as they were, and we had to have a special cannon built that would act as a parade for the parade grounds and for the salute cannon. The society itself, the Fort Simcoe Mool Mool Restoration Society, had the help of various individuals that were very much interested. One especially was Susie Bartlett, and Susie Bartlett had originally been Susie Irwin, and she was the daughter of the Indian Agency at the early days. Susie always claimed to be the first white child born at Fort Simcoe, and other people have had to claim that they were the first, but it's kind of hard to determine sometimes on exactly. But Susie had personal memories of what took place, and was very, very helpful to us. And the first thing we decided to do was to restore the officers' quarters at Fort Simcoe. And this was all done with a plan with the state, that we'd start out with the Commandant's house. The Commandant's house was in the center of the officers' row, and that was the house that was occupied by Major Garnett at the time he was Commandant at Fort Simcoe. Fort Simcoe had started in 1856. It was erected in 1856 by the 9th Infantry Regiment under Major Garnett, and with the idea of protecting the reservation against the influx of bootleggers and unscrupulous people that wanted to take advantage of the Indians. It was not erected to protect the white people. It was erected to protect the reservation. And Major Garnett and the crew from the 9th Infantry Regiment, and with the help of the architects from Fort Dalles, where they designed the buildings and erected the buildings. And incidentally, the buildings themselves are interesting because were erected of wood, but unbeknownst to a lot of people, the buildings are actually brick buildings in a way. There are brick in between the joist, the uprights, and between the studs, and it's bricked. And that brick was put in there, and the brick was incidentally fired at the fort. It was put in the walls for insulation because it was terribly hot at Fort Simcoe and very cold in the winter, so the brick was put in there to insulate, and it's still there, of course. The Commandant's house was occupied by Major Garnett. Upstairs he had his offices as a commandant of the military. And after the military left, why the Indian agent moved into the commandant's quarters and maintained more or less the same kind of arrangement. Then there's one blockhouse that was left on the southwest corner of the fort grounds, and that blockhouse is the original, and it has been restored to a certain extent. And other blockhouses were added, rebuilt and added, but then on the east end of the parade grounds, we'd had some other buildings that, in order to have proper restoration, we had to move some of them, and we moved some of those down to the east end of from the parade grounds down to where the parking lot is now. And unfortunately, some kids came in there one day and burned them up. So the buildings we still have are the four officers' houses, a rebuilt barracks on the south side, and the blockhouse, and then the state has added a house for the director out there, for the director of the fort, superintendent of the fort, and also has added restrooms. We've added some of the facilities that originally existed on the officers' quarters, such as the stockade around the back of the commandant's house. And there's quite a lot of restoration over the years. This took a lot of work on the part of the society. The society actually owns the furnishings that are in the officers' quarters and some of the things in the museum, but we loaned them to the state parks on a permanent loan basis. But we still maintain them. We're put new foundations under the buildings and made interior repairs as they were needed, leveled the buildings. But most of the buildings, I say, were in rather remarkable condition. And then the society went a step further and took it on themselves to furnish those buildings so that they would be attractive to the public. And we started out with the commandant's house, and we obtained donations of furniture from various families in the Yakima Valley, and much of this furniture, actually, some of it had been used at the Fort Simcoe. And we were able to completely furnish the commandant's house in the period of the fort. The house to the north was a captain's house, and at that house we decided that we would furnish that in the period of the agency. And that's the way it is finished and furnished in the period of the agency. The two lieutenants' houses to the south, the officers' row, were repaired and leveled and everything of that kind, but over the years they still have a lot yet to be done to finish them in the final place that we'd like to have them. But nevertheless, eventually it'll be done. During the agency period, there was a brick building built at the fort, and this brick building was actually built as a warehouse, and we conceived the idea of making that into a museum, and that was agreeable to state parks, and it was made into a museum, and we again went out and obtained materials to put in that museum. Other materials were forthcoming from other places, and it's quite a nice interpretive center at the present time. There were other buildings at the fort at the time. The old jail that was there during the fort at the time, the old jail that was there during the fort days and agency days, still standing. It was kind of a bleak corrugated iron building that they used to put the recalcitrant Indians and soldiers in, and it's still standing, and we're able to repair that. Unfortunately, there was another row of buildings on the south side of the parade ground that, such as the pharmacy and other offices, that burned during this, actually before we got the work going. Going back to the society itself, I think we were and I know we were very successful because there are so many things that we were able to restore, and the old cemetery down there, and unfortunately so many things through fire and so forth. At the time we had taken over, there was the original cavalry barn was still there, and it was destroyed by fire, unfortunately, and no fire protection to speak of. And the schoolhouses that were started by Father Wilbur, who was the Indian agent. He started these two schools, boarding schools, mandatory attendance by the Indians. And when the agency was abandoned, why the schools likewise became in disrepair. And the same thing, everything was, well, they're full of debris and manure. Everything else was in these buildings, and the cost for us to restore the buildings was just prohibitive. At that time, we couldn't get the state of Washington to even consider, because they got a bid on restoring the buildings. It run over $1 million apiece, and at that time, that money was, you just couldn't even get anybody interested in them at that time. So those had to be torn down because they were fire hazard. The original jailhouse, not the one with the corrugated iron, but there was the original military brig jailhouse, stood down further along toward the east end of the parade grounds, and that was made out of 2x4s and logs, 2x4s, 2x6s and logs. And when the fort was abandoned, why, that was moved down to, they gave it or sold it to somebody, moved down to White Swan when this White Swan became a town, and it was moved down there, and we were able to rescue the old jailhouse, and it's the original, and it's at Fort Simcoe now by the parade ground. And those are the sort of things that the society has done, and so we've worked cooperative. The society is still in existence, but not active, except we still keep an eye on things. We're the watchdogs, so to speak. There's a lot of other things, interesting stories. For example, Fort Simcoe was overrun by the rattlesnakes, and they were everywhere. And of course, we're a little apprehensive about rattlesnakes, although you don't hear people getting bitten in the Yakima Valley very often, but we have a lot of rattlesnakes. And a very simple answer to take care of the rattlesnakes at Fort Simcoe. We got some ranchers that were willing to bring in a band of sheep in the spring, and sheep will kill rattlesnakes. And so turn them loose on Fort Simcoe with the grounds there, and they kill the rattlesnakes. Well, and of course there's various stories there. And we've had even had some burglaries out there. People trying to steal some of our artifacts, and have stolen some of them. But taken as a whole, why, it's been very successful. It's become a very popular picnic area. The trees that were the oak trees and the oak grove down the east end of the fort grounds were the same oak trees that were there and when the fort was started. And a couple of those trees had the honor or dishonor, whatever you want to call it, of being hanging trees, where they hung the Indians who murdered the Perkins family. And the oak grove itself is historically important, and of course, that is really what attracted the military there. The fort overlooked the lower Yakima Valley. Another thing that the society did was very active. We got together with the Chamber of Commerce in Yakima and also the Elks Lodge, and right after we had dedicated the Fort Simcoe in 1956, just 100 years from the time it was built, we started what we thought was very good, and what was very good was the annual Flag Day celebration at Fort Simcoe. The first Flag Day celebration the next year after we'd dedicated the fort, we had over 20,000 people in the valley attended Flag Day ceremony at Fort Simcoe. In our Flag Day celebrations, we had full cooperation of the military. They sent in troops from Fort Lewis to help us out, and we had airplanes come in and things of that kind, and we had full cooperation, and the troops would have a retreat there and review. The Indian Nation joined in with it, and we'd had their Indian powwow at the time. We'd have all these Indians in their regalia, and as I say, the first one we had over 20,000 people attended, and we had those for a period of about 7 or 8 years, I believe, and then the attendance began to taper off some, and we had a little trouble at that time getting financial support from the chamber anymore. They felt it had run its course as for their use. They have been thinking maybe that they'll be able to help sponsor another Flag Day, perhaps during the centennial of the state of Washington. I tell people that I think they should start out at the commandant's house and see how they lived, and see how those buildings are built, and then of course you can still look out to the east and see the Yakima Valley and why it was important, and walk around the parade grounds, because they are as they were except for the grass, and the interpretive center. And by all means, one should take a walk up to the hill on the south of the fort and go to the old blockhouse. It's still the old squared off logs that are there, and it's not in too good a shape, but it has a good roof on it to protect it. And I think it's a walking tour around the fort, that around the back of the buildings. Look at the buildings closely, because it's rather interesting. In those days, the people were not very tall. Our average height of American people has gone from about 5'2" to closer to 5'7" or 5'6", somewhere in that neighborhood. Look at the doorways. You have to stoop. You'd have to stoop to go through the doorways. That is, a lot of the doorways. Some of the doorways are big doors, but a lot of them were these doors that you had to stoop to go through. And we have the kitchen there restored to its original form, and you can see how they cooked on the fireplace, and the utensils they used. This is all part of it, and it's just a walk-in tour to go through there, because if you want a lesson or a study in history as people lived in 100 years plus ago in the Yakima Valley, and actually Yakima Valley is new, historically speaking. You get the whole story right out there.
To get to Fort Simcoe from Yakima, take US 97 south to the Lateral A cutoff. Then go 10 miles to the Fort Road, which is Highway 220. Turn right on the Fort Road, drive through White Swan, and on out to the fort. For more information, the park ranger's phone number at Fort Simcoe is area code 509. The number is 874-2372.